Thanks so much, Rich, for having me. Thanks for that intro. I really loved our last conversation about my book, The Presidents and the People. We went really deep into it. And thanks, too, for the intro about the podcast. I hope people will check it out. I was saying, too, that Rich is my Substack mentor. I didn't have a Substack when we first spoke with each other, but I got very interested in it, partly as a result of our discussion. And now we have a Substack, which would be great if your listeners and readers would check us out. It's called The Oath in the Office. I think we're linked to it on this. And what we're doing every week is taking the stories that we talk about on the podcast, which are usually about the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and all framed really with the idea that the oath is required of a president. It's spelled out word for word in Article 2 that the president has to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And my thesis is that this president is really doing anything but that. And yet we have to hold him to account. And that's really what we're doing every week, taking the Constitution, taking the case law, the principles of the Constitution, the idea of democracy, of we the people, and using it to think about what's happening every week. So it's not just a news show. It goes way beyond that. It's sort of a mix of news and civics and the kind of thing I think that your informed listeners would might like to hear and to read on the Substack. So thanks so much, Rich, for your Substack mentorship, I'll call.
Okay. And you're performing a big service as so many people in the academic world and the journalism world are doing right now. I thought it might be interesting to start out with your thoughts on the 108 minutes of our lives that we dedicated to watching the State of the Union on Tuesday night. And that's time we'll never get back. But what are your takeaways from that?
Well, I'll narrow in on one moment, which it's very hard to be shocked by Donald Trump or anything that he does. This is supposed to be a symbol, the State of the Union, in which all three branches come together. And the framers had an idea of the three branches as being engaged in a mutual deliberation about the common good. That was supposed to be the idea. And that's why you have the court justices there. I think that symbolizes it. Of course, it's an address to Congress. The Constitution does require that from time to time, is how it puts it, that the president give this address. It's not specified every year, but of course that's come to be the case. And what did you have? You had, rather than a respect for the Constitution or respect for the office, I talked about the oath, you had anything but. I'll compare it just so you see the contrast to George Washington's second inaugural, the shortest ever given. Washington says at that moment, I just took the oath of office, and if I violate it, I want the people here assembled to subject me to upbraidings, is the word he uses, or criticism. And if I really violate it, subject me to constitutional punishment. Compare that to the speech that we heard with the president just railing on the opposition, and at one point with Representative Omar saying that his opponents were crazy. And that's really the opposite of how this system is supposed to function. And when you hear him calling the opposition crazy, it's an example of what people in comparative politics, scholars call the disloyal opposition. It's just a sort of rejection of the idea that's fundamental to democracy, that if we're going to be, in politics together, we're still part of one polity, even if one group controls the government at one time. And by calling your opposition crazy, he really is symbolizing yet again how much this administration, how much his presidency is an assault on democracy itself.
Why do you think he's choosing to do that?
Well, I think he really is an authoritarian. He doesn't have a deep ideology. He, has an instinct for control and governance, but that's compatible with an authoritarian, I wouldn't call it a philosophy, but disposition. And the way he understands and has always understood American government is that it's about he's in charge. In fact, he misinterprets the Constitution sometimes. He says, at various points, he said, I have an Article 2. It says I can do anything I want. Article 2, of course, I don't think he understands this. Article 1 of the Constitution creates Congress and limits it. Article 2 creates the presidency and limits it. Article 3 creates the Supreme Court and the possibility of inferior courts and also limits their role. And yet he thinks somehow that one of these three articles, the one that actually constrains him, in the same way the other branches are constrained, giving different powers to each, gives him all the power. And that's how he's tried to govern. And civil liberties, the Bill of Rights, none of that means anything to him. So, and, in the first administration, he was surrounded by people who said, no, you can't do that. And that's all gone. And you see how dangerous this position is. As much as I've just spoken about the way this thing is supposed to work, this Constitution, there's a vulnerability. And I think you and I talked about one of the figures from early American history that I'm fascinated by, and I write about in The Presidents and the People, and that's Patrick Henry, who says, look, the presidency is supposed to be, if it's George Washington, no problem. But what if you have a bad president? And then he actually goes so far, Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero turned opponent of ratification of the Constitution. He says, what if you have a criminal president? Well, the worry is that there's really no, this is his quote, force to what will stop this force, is the way he asked the question rhetorically. There is nothing that will work. And so, you see this president not frightened of impeachment because his allies in the House and Senate will protect him from that as of now. And you see him ripping through the criminal law, even though there were two indictments and should have been two convictions from all the evidence. He was able to, partly with the aid, unfortunately, of the Supreme Court, to undo that constraint. So, you have this ideal of how our system is supposed to function, but you also have an inherent danger in it. And he's really brought that out and risks really destroying the system as a whole.
I thought it was an interesting measure of his self-confidence that he chose to make fighting corruption part of his message and appointing J.D. Vance as the fraud czar, anti-fraud czar, when you could argue that what Trump has done is tear down all the barriers to the watchdogs who are preventing corruption.
The corruption is rampant. I mean, it was rampant in the first administration. Think of the Trump Hotel and the way that he used it to host ambassadors and dignitaries in order to siphon money in, and the various crypto scams that have gone on. The list of using the office for his own enrichment and the enrichment of his family, including Don Jr., is off the charts now, because if you give somebody who has a criminal disposition immunity, you supercharge their desire to use the office for profit. I mean, the irony is that in the Constitution itself, the framers were acutely aware of this danger, that a president would use the power of the presidency to enrich themselves financially. And they had seen that, of course, with the problem with monarchy, the system they were rejecting. And so they put into the Constitution two emoluments clauses, one specifying no domestic emoluments. Emoluments just means using the office for profit. Can't use the domestic institutions to do that. And the other, a separate foreign emoluments clause to prevent foreign policy from being used as a way of enriching the president. Now, the problem is that immunity undercuts the various ways that we might have had to hold this corruption to account, and leaves impeachment, which is not a real option. And so he really has created a for-profit presidency, put that Trump brand for-profit onto the presidency. The idea that he doesn't take a salary, of course, is a joke. I'm sure you've seen all this reporting, Rash, and many of your readers have, but it's in the billions of dollars, the amount of corruption that journalists are now trying to estimate how much it is, and they're putting it in the billions.
What did you think, just purely in political terms? We're, I guess, about 9 months from the midterm elections. The polls show that Trump is extremely unpopular. He's got about a 36% approval rating, according to the CNN poll, and I think a 26% approval rating among independents. So take the State of the Union and assess it as the message that he's delivering for voters ahead of the midterms.
I mean, 36 shows, some reduction from the usual 40 that he's had, 39, 40, but, 4 points with all that's gone on, including, to my mind, at the forefront, the murder of 2 U.S. citizens in Minnesota, and the responsibility that he and Stephen Miller bear for unleashing stormtroopers, Gestapo-like force onto the country. I mean, the stormtroopers, the SA, I think, is probably, I try to shy away from Hitler analogies, but it just looks too apt that you would have this untrained, undisciplined, wild group of ideologues in the streets, basically attacking people. And that's what we watched on television in Minnesota. That that horrific action. You would think that as Americans saw, not, when I talk about the abstract principles of the Constitution, I get it. That's sometimes hard for people to grasp. When you see citizens being murdered by a stormtrooper force led by the government, ICE, namely, to be specific, I would have just hoped that the numbers drop more. So I don't know. The 36 doesn't give me encouragement. It gives me worry because he's never cared about governing for the majority of the country. He just cares about governing for his base. And if he's only lost 4%, I think in his mind, and you heard about how great the country is doing in his mind, that's fine. I mean, I was asked to comment for Reuters for about the State of the Union. Should the justices attend? And my view is it is really important that the justices attend because they by sitting there send that symbol of they're part of the government. And his part of his assault, I think that's relevant too, on the justices after the really important tariffs case, which we can talk about, shows again, just in so many different ways that he has no respect for our system of government. And the fact that that still results in 36% approval, I'm flabbergasted by it.
Of course, last year he stirred up a lot of controversy by thanking John Roberts effusively and saying, "I won't forget it."
Yeah.
And there was a lot of interpretation afterwards about what he was thanking him for, and
I mean, it
a
might
lot
be
of people,
immunity, I think is one word.
yes, yes, everybody concluded immunity. Trump said, "Oh, you liberals, you're crazy." I was just thanking him for administering the oath of office
Mm.
at the inauguration, but
Yeah. I mean, John Roberts, as much as I'll praise the tariffs case that we just saw, it's a really important assertion by the court, a re-recognition of legislative power. And I had an amicus brief with a group called Democracy Forward, essentially foreshadowing the arguments that the court made. If they had gone the other way in the direction of Kavanaugh, I really would have started to despair that we're not in a constitutional crisis. It's over and the president's won. So it's good that we're in a constitutional crisis. The branches are battling one another, and that was an example of it. But I don't want to be effusive in any way in my praise for the Supreme Court because Justice Roberts has really done us a historic disservice. That immunity case, essentially saying that, you could talk about the subtleties of it, but essentially saying that the president is above the law, has incentivized his worst authoritarian and criminal instincts. And far from stopping this force the way that Patrick Henry asked, he's making Henry's point. Now, this is a kind of retrenchment on what the court has often done, which is not just in that case, but also in what's known as the shadow docket, where the court's legitimacy comes largely from invoking the law and giving us reasons for why what they're doing. It's a unique branch that way. It doesn't come from election; it comes from its reasoning process as defense of the Constitution. And in the shadow docket, they don't give us reasons. And they have just again and again undermined the lower courts, giving Trump power. Now, here in the immunity decision, I keep saying the immunity, in the tariffs case, they give their reasons and they do so quite brilliantly. And disparage, too, I should say, Kavanaugh and the dissenters for not doing their jobs, for not even being judges, is the way that I read the rightful criticism of that minority. So, it's a fraught moment. You have a president trying to destroy democracy. You have a court that has largely enabled them, although they've pushed back. And we've got to start thinking about, as citizens, and we talked about this last time, how do we undo so much of this damage? So on the Oath in the Office podcast, we've had a lot of discussions about how to reverse the immunity case, including with Sheldon Whitehouse. And what's nice about a podcast that's, an hour long is it's not just here's a couple of questions for Sheldon Whitehouse. I was really able to engage him in I thought, a creative discussion about various ways of doing it. An amendment is the obvious thing that's been proposed, but it's almost impossible to get. So we instead talked about how to craft legislation that would limit presidential immunity by taking the exceptions to immunity in the decision, in particular, the idea that the act has to be official. And we were suggesting together that we should narrow the meaning of official so much that it almost disappears. And that would be a way through legislation of correcting course. And I think it's so important that the next Congress do exactly that. We had a similar discussion about war powers with Ted Lieu. And, that's what I'm trying to do, not just to, here's a politician, what do they think? But to engage them the way I'm engaging you and engaging the listeners and trying to think about how we recover this democracy, because we are in serious trouble. A constitutional crisis would be a good thing because it means we're still fighting. But the destruction of democracy through what I've called a self coup, the destruction of the other branches through the president, that's what I'm worried about. And that's potentially what's at stake here.
Excellent point. Take the tariffs decision, which, I agree with your take on it, but immediately Trump imposed other tariffs, and he has other, quote, authorities, so he can tariff the world that way. It's a little bit more complicated, and there are time limits and so on, but
Mm.
does that effectively nullify what the court did?
No, he's trying to resist, and he's an authoritarian that doesn't want to obey the decision. I'm sure that if he could, he would just simply defy it. But he's being told, at least by the advisors that are near him, that you can't do that. And although his initial reaction and that initial denunciation of the court suggested that he would just do exactly what he had been doing before, now over time, the reporting is suggesting he realizes the tariffs are going to have to take a different character. And one of the things that he's seen is that there are time limits. So that's what we have to watch. If he tries to impose the same tariffs, there'll be more litigation, and I think he will lose by 6-3 and will be sent a message a second time. No, you can't do this. If we get to the point where he is just defying the court rather than seeking other authorities, which, that's fair enough. He can do that and we can litigate through them. And as you say, the time limit is important, right? That's very different to have a limited tariff that then has to be authorized by Congress under the trade statutes that he's looking at, as opposed to IEPA, the Emergency Act that would give him essentially unlimited unilateral power. So that is a kind of victory if, he only gets a time-limited tariff. I do think the courts are going to slap him down. And if he tries to defy the order, that they'll stop him. Now, one thing we've talked about on the oath in the office is we haven't seen an outright defiance of the Supreme Court by this administration, but we've often seen defiance of lower court decisions. And most grotesquely in the Judge Boasberg example, when Judge Boasberg ordered planes being sent to a gulag in El Salvador sent back, the administration refused. They sent those people anyway. And Boasberg has been trying, this is a Republican appointee, to bring contempt hearings against whoever's done this and to investigate it. It looks like it goes pretty high up, possibly to Christine Marcel, possibly to the president. And although the president has immunity from prosecution, his colleagues have some immunity, but not absolute immunity. And yes, they can be criminally prosecuted if they outright defy a judicial order. So, these are the dynamics that we're facing in the reality of the moment. The branches, thankfully, the judicial branch, the lower courts, and now the Supreme Court backing them up, sending the message, no, we're not ceding power. If you read Kavanaugh's dissent, it's a frightful reminder of how close we are to a total destruction of the system, because it would, Robert says in his majority decision, Justice Kavanaugh has just taken almost word for word, cut and pasted the administration's argument and put it into, that's not judging. And, if we had a few more Kavanaughs and a few less justices willing to do their job, we'd be in real trouble. This is more than a crisis. It's inching towards the self-coup idea.
And what are you looking for in the rest of the Supreme Court term? Is the birthright citizenship case the big one?
Oh,
are
yeah.
there others?
I mean, that, when I talk about self-coup, I should just define the term, what I'm talking about. When we think about coups against democracy, we often think about the outside military kind of coming in with force and deposing a government. But a self-coup is very different. It's that you use the instruments of government from the inside, and in particular in those countries in Latin America, for instance, that have taken our system, the presidential system, you see it regularly. You use the position of the presidency to eliminate the power of Congress or the judiciary. Now, sometimes that can be done by actually shutting those institutions down, but it also can be done by putting your people into those institutions so that they no longer function as they should as a check on the presidency. And, the birthright citizenship case, to be frank, is a real test because it says in the Constitution, if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. It couldn't be more plain. And the BS argument that this administration, historically without any merit, that subject to the jurisdiction somehow gives the limit to the children of undocumented people. There is no historical evidence for that. They're making it up. And if the court goes along with it, that really is a travesty. They've already talking about infractions against democracy from the Roberts Court. The decision to eliminate universal injunctions in the birthright citizenship case is, misguided. It strips the court of a needed power to protect us against abuses like this. And the timing is absurd. Why did they not do that during Biden if this was really a principled stance?
So it's obviously down to three justices: Gorsuch, um, Barrett, and Roberts. How do you think they'll go on birthright?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I think that the tariffs case is just one of those cases like birthright citizenship, where if they had gone the other way, I would have been in the category of, I'm hopeful. I hesitate to call myself an optimist. I think there's a chance, a good chance, that if with effort and with agency, people can reclaim their democracy. And this, makes me think it's not all lost. And the birthright citizenship case is like that too. I do believe that it's going to be 6-3, but I could be proven wrong. And, in particular, those three justices, I'll tell you, I'll leave Roberts aside. Gorsuch and Barrett want to prove to the country and to their colleagues, and I think, frankly, to academics who they are concerned with. Um, by the way, Gorsuch is the only justice with a PhD in philosophy, actually in legal philosophy, under John Finnis at Oxford. And Barrett, of course, was an academic. She doesn't have a PhD, but she taught at Notre Dame Law School. And they're really trying to show themselves as principled justices. Do they always succeed? No. But for both of them, broadly, the theory of originalism and textualism is the thing they care about doing. And so for Gorsuch, in the Bostock case, he said the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when it says you can't discriminate based on sex, he made the argument that applies to gay and transgender people, even though ideologically you would think that's not his view. And that's a way of showing the text matters when it comes to the interpretation of the International Economic Emergencies Act, IEPA, which was passed after Nixon in order to rein in presidential power. They say, yeah, when you read the text, it's not an enabling statute. It's one that reduces presidential power. So, that suggests to me that if you're a textualist, you better read the text that says if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. They made it simple for a reason. They wanted a clear rule, they being the 19th century, those devoted to Reconstruction, the so-called radical Republicans who drafted that language, partly with the encouragement and advocacy of people like Frederick Douglass. We wanted a clear rule of equality. And so I just think that, these other two decisions suggest those two are going to be on the right side. That's my hope. I don't know that I would have thought that before the decision, but it's given me a lot of hope. Roberts, I don't know what to make of him. I mean, he seems to be some strange political player. I think he doesn't like 5-4 decisions. He'll often join the five in order to make it look more legitimate. I think that's part of what went on here. But what his principled commitments are, I'm just not sure. If you look at what he said in his confirmation hearing, it gives you a little sense. He's talked about sometimes I'm an originalist, sometimes I'm a principled reading. So I don't think he really has a view. He's just trying to hang on, and that immunity decision is up there with the most dangerous and worst in American history. That's what he'll be remembered for, and so hopefully he's trying to recover.
Is Kavanaugh a lost cause on
Yes.
birthright citizenship?
Yeah. He is a total. I mean, I cannot say enough derogatory things about this person. I mean, when he was um, nominated, I wrote a piece in Politico called Kavanaugh's Radical View of Executive Power. And he had been part of the team in Bush v. Gore on the Bush side. And when you look at what he says over time, he really doesn't believe in constraints on the presidency. He's not thoughtful enough to be called the unitary executive person. That is a real theory that we debate about, a pro-executive power theory. But he just takes it to a different level. So he thinks U.S. versus Nixon was either wrongly decided or should be so narrowed that it's not about anything really beyond what happened in the specific historical case. And what I warned about in that piece, this was before the accusations about sexual assault came out, was that this is somebody who's just going to enable a tyrannical president. That was, in the first term, of course, but he really has carried through on that worry. And the justices calling him out in the tariffs case is a really great moment. They're essentially saying that you are not a judge. It's just like you're just saying yes to Trump. Somebody says in the uh, chat, so is his political philosophy not loyalty to Trump? Yeah, that's fair enough. I don't know that I call it a political philosophy. It's a
Yeah.
authoritarian bowing down. He also, I
Yeah.
mean, he's just such a weird person that when he was nominated, gave a speech about how Donald Trump had vetted more judges and done the job of choosing a justice in a more thorough way than anyone ever before him, and he just happened to come up with me. I mean, it's like just a narcissistic weirdo, and I can't say enough bad things about him. I'm not a litigator before the Supreme Court, and litigators often are much more careful than I'm being. But I just think this is a hack, not a serious judge.
So let's talk about something from your book where you wrote about Patrick Henry's warning about authoritarianism, and you described the presidency as a loaded gun. And that applies very strongly, I think, to what's happening with Iran right now. What's your take on war powers and Trump's use of them?
We had a moment, a very important one that's often forgotten at the end of Nixon's presidency and then after Watergate, where Congress really asserted its own power and they tried to figure out various ways through legislation of curbing presidential power. And those ideas largely failed, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. And we could talk about each of them. The Emergencies Act, IEPA, they had a way that Congress could just, with a majority vote, stop a president. And over time, partly as a result of pressure from the Supreme Court, they reversed that into essentially giving themselves a requirement of 2/3 in order to stop emergencies, for instance. And another example of their failure is the War Powers Act, which was meant to stop a president from abusing the commander in chief power. Just to go back to basics, Article 2 of the Constitution does give the power to the president to be commander of all military forces, commander in chief. But the power to initiate war or declare war is given to Congress. So what the War Powers Act was meant to do was to reclaim that Article 1 power of Congress and to say you can't initiate war. But the way that they did it, essentially enabled presidents to have a time period where they could begin a war. And that fact, is abused by presidents. And, quick strikes, for instance, they argue are not warlike, although they are, of course, wars. It is war. It is the initiation of war. And so, that's one of the things I think that we need to look at. The idea, just to kind of show how the framers had it in mind, was that the king, the monarch in England, can initiate war and was commander in chief. And what we needed to do was to divide those two powers into two, and that would limit it. And the framers were very skeptical of war. They thought, in particular, that it would be better to err on the side of caution, because once you go into a war foolishly, all of the energy of the republic, including all of its money, is going to go to that war. They saw that. So yeah, it would slow things down. And that's what I think we need to move back to. I mentioned the discussion with Ted Lieu. One reason I was very eager to have him on the podcast, and this isn't something you see covered, I should say, in mainstream media, unfortunately, is that he's the sponsor of a really important bill that's part of what I'm suggesting. And it's called the First Strike Bill, one of the real dangers that we saw during Nixon is he was getting drunk and basically insinuating that he might launch a nuclear attack on his enemies. And Trump, if he really gets into a conflict with Iran, I worry that that rhetoric might be up. The first strike bill would just deprive the president of the power to launch a first strike of nuclear weapons, with the idea that that it is an act of war and Congress would have to deliberate first. And better to, yes, risk that the slowness of that deliberation would be a mistake rather than empower what could be an erratic, unhinged person from having that power to destroy the world. And that's true. Lou and I focus on his bill, which is about nuclear weapons, but that's my philosophy more generally, that we need to rewrite the War Powers Act with no um, time lag. It's basically to reclaim the power that the moment you try to initiate war, that requires an act of Congress.
Um, you know, the ineffectiveness of the War Powers Act is something we could do a whole interview about, but I think it's Jack Goldstein, this constitutional lawyer, scholar, has said basically the U.S. system is, and when it comes to declaring war and launching military attacks, one person decides. That's
I mean,
essentially it.
that's not what it says. Everybody is welcome to read the
Mhm.
Constitution for themselves, but it's kind of like birthright citizenship. Yeah, constitutional lawyers are in the business of, you know, trying to come up with innovative. That's a nice way to say it. Contrarian arguments. But there are certain
Mhm.
things that are just so obvious, and birthright citizenship, much to my chagrin, is one of them. I mean, I will say, John Eastman, who designed the coup of January 6th, that's his main claim to fame, tried to get on Trump's radar, did get on Trump's radar originally by floating this idea that subject to the jurisdiction meant that undocumented people's children weren't citizens. It was a total hack out there view from this, Claremont group. I went to Pomona, so I distinguish any of the Claremont colleges, importantly, from the Claremont Institute, which Eastman was associated with. Not a serious argument, so much so that it's kind of amazing to think about this, but I was invited to debate him at one point, and I said, "I'm not gonna debate somebody whose view is so far out there." Well, now you have to talk about it, of course, because the court is considering it, and there are at least 4 votes to take it seriously. So, whether that will translate in how it will translate in the end, I've said my prediction, which is 6-3, that they will not limit birthright citizenship. They'll give it its original meaning. But war powers are like that. It's Congress has the power to declare war. You can read it, and it's only
Yeah.
through a totally twisted reading of the word declare, which it means observed rather than initiate, that we've gotten to this idea that the president somehow can initiate war, and it's just false.
But haven't we had 70 years of
Yeah.
practice where the presidents have been initiating war?
Absolutely, and that's true of so much of our constitutional system. There's a lot of blame to go around for how we've really lost the idea of the separation of powers and enabled, a monarch kind of president, an elected monarch. We'll see how long that lasts. The problem with elected monarchs is that they might not want to lose power, and if they really are monarchs, it's
Yeah.
sort of up to them. That's the worry. But yeah,
So
war
one of
powers has been a disaster. It's not that they didn't try. Again, the Congress did try after Watergate in a number of different areas. We also, by the way, just to show you that some of these things did work temporarily, one of the most important reform, I think, was the independent counsel law, created by the Ethics in Government Act, which Nixon's cronies, Bork and Scalia, hated, and their opposition to it in many ways formed the modern unitary executive. And what the law said is that, signed by Carter, the Ethics in Government Act, is that we're never going to allow another Saturday Night Massacre. Saturday Night Massacre, of course, is a symbol of the imperial presidency because Nixon just fired Archibald Cox, who was looking into his wrongdoing. So what the way that the independent counsel law worked, the Ethics in Government Act, is it created appointed from a 3-judge panel at the suggestion of the Attorney General from Washington, D.C., this person who couldn't be fired by the president unless they were doing a bad job, and that was subject to judicial review, who had to give reports to Congress. And it functioned pretty well. Lawrence Welsh, for instance, had a very serious investigation of both Reagan and Bush and Iran-Contra. Ken Starr, was an independent counsel. He was the last one, and you can imagine the story of how it was destroyed. That Bill Clinton, after praising it, said, "Well, Ken Starr is abusive. I'm getting rid of it." And he worked with Congress to make sure that law never appeared again. That's why we are where we were. We never would have had an immunity decision. I think we would have had a prosecution of Donald Trump if Mueller had been an independent prosecutor, and you would have had him removed from office as a result of that prosecution. But we took away our best tool that operated for years, largely because Clinton didn't like being, unfairly attacked. I gave an interview to Politico where they use this as their headline. I said, "Better 10 Ken Starrs than one Donald Trump." Like, yeah, Ken Starr was an abusive prosecutor, but the real risk is not independent prosecutors; it's presidents who are
Yeah.
criminal.
So let's zoom out a little bit and on a scale of 1 to 10, and assume that 1 is normal functioning of the US government, and 5 is a constitutional crisis, and 10 is the complete end of democracy. Where do you think we are on that scale?
So 1 is the good and 10 is the really bad one. I think
Yes.
we're probably at 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Inching towards 8. And, it's sort of we move between 7 and 8 every day. We're sort
Yeah.
of tracking it on the oath in the office every week. And, it's a mix. There are moments like the immunity decision where, we're like, it just skyrockets up that brought the constitutional crisis. I don't know what the exact number is, but it way up the scale. And then the immunity decision, the tariffs decision tempers that a little bit. You see the court asserting itself, looking to find its own power. The lower courts have tempered it in many of the moments. Minnesota, was a 9. You had ICE for a long period of time out on the streets, engaging in assault and murder in 2 cases that we all watched. And then you had Kristi Noem not only refusing to take responsibility, but not only refusing to take responsibility, but essentially covering up and saying that there was not accountability. You had the Vice President of the United States, just to talk about how serious it was, lying to the American public and saying basically ICE agents are above the law and can commit crimes. I mean, that just upped the level. We were certainly at a 9 on the democracy DEFCON scale, uh,
Yeah.
that at that moment. And then, states fight back. Lawsuits, including the lawsuit that said the entire operation of ICE was a violation of the 10th Amendment and aggrandizement of congressional power way beyond where it should be. And all of those, that kind of pushback and the various other suits, lower courts pushing back against military deployment, those brought us, back towards an 8 from a 9. So, it's not it's good that people "Oh, we're in a constitutional crisis." No, constitutional crisis is like a 5. We're beyond that. 10 is self-coup. We're somewhere between those 2 things.
Take your friend Justice Kavanaugh. He said it's okay to stop people based on their ethnicity. So if they're Latino, you can stop and apprehend them.
Yeah.
Um,
They're calling it
and
Kavanaugh
then I
stop.
think, yeah, I think he tried to pull that back a little bit, but
Yeah, I mean, one of the things it's an interesting example of the way lawyers often analyze this. So, if you really are careful and you work in this area, it's not that he said this can be the sole factor, but it's one of several factors. But now how's that gonna translate to an untrained ICE agent? The training that they've had is like 0. They haven't learned about the Constitution, although evidently they did at one point. A lot of the training is online. And so, they're gonna really be able to interpret this, somebody with 0 training, this subtle Supreme Court ruling. No, they're gonna say, "I can stop somebody based on ethnicity and race," and that's exactly what they're doing.
so Corey, let's leave our audience with somewhat of a more hopeful
Yeah.
scenario. And your book, you write about constitutional recoveries that happen after presidents abuse the Constitution. And could you paint a scenario, sort of your ideal scenario for how we recover from the Trump second term presidency?
Yeah, I should say every week on the Oath in the Office podcast, and I hope the people who are watching this will check it out. We are the whole point of why I wanted to do it and why I wanted to do it with this brilliant thinker and comedian, John Fugelsang, is because we're doing two things. We're trying to be really honest about what's happening and not provide hope by hiding from the horror show that is the Trump presidency, the attempt to collapse democracy. But we're also each week doing what you just asked, talking about how citizens can fight back. It's why I started a podcast to try to get into this idea that in the end, throughout American history, and as we talked about last time, this is the thesis of my book, it actually is not courts that save us. It isn't even Congress that saves us. It's citizens taking the Constitution into their own hands and trying to reclaim it. And they do that through elections. We have the midterms coming up, through presidential elections, by speaking out and by defying authoritarian presidents who seek to shut us down. And by speaking out, that's what we're doing every week. Natasha is saying it's a
Great
great
show.
show. She listens, so thank you, Natasha.
She seems like a former student,
Maybe.
but, and, yeah, so if citizens can reclaim democracy to the full extent, how can they do it?
Well, you can show it through examples, and one of the important points about past crises that reflect these, and really each of the crises I talk about in the past, 5 crises, of presidents trying to destroy democracy, the way that we have recovered was not through courts. Courts always made it worse. And it was specifically through citizens taking the Constitution into their own hands and forming what I call in the book democratic constitutional constituencies. And that is frankly what I'm trying to do, partly with the podcast, to get a coalition of citizens together, partly from engaging public officials who are organizing around the idea of recovering free speech, ideas of equal protection, which have been destroyed by this president and the court, and the idea that no person, not even a president, is above the law. And when you look in these examples and you see how they succeeded, and that you see this isn't just some pie in the sky idea. I wasn't interested in writing a book about like, oh, wouldn't it be great if? No, this worked. So take the first example. John Adams actually did shut down the opposition party. He signed the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to criticize the president, but left it perfectly legal to criticize the vice president, his main opponent, Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson couldn't criticize his political opponent, but Adams could. Now, how did we survive that? The court made it worse. The court actually oversaw, including Samuel Chase, most prominent Supreme Court justice of his time, the prosecution of people like Thomas Cooper. But the people prosecuted, including these editors, used their own trials to put Adams on trial, to put Chase on trial. And they used the election of 1800 to reclaim our constitutional system. And you see that play out repeatedly. Frederick Douglass, in a moment where he had nothing but you could expect despair, to give up, that the president and the Supreme Court had teamed up to deny all rights to Black Americans under the Constitution. I mean, that's an incredibly destructive moment. And yet Douglass says, well, they don't have the Constitution right. It says we the people, not we the white people. He organizes through Black conventions, speeches, writing for listeners. And by the way, the audience at the time that Douglass is writing is very fragmented. It's like our audiences, not huge numbers. It's not millions of people. And he's able to use that in order to prevail eventually to some degree on Lincoln. I talk about how Lincoln fell short. In fact, Douglass calls him at his eulogy a white man's president. But in the Grant administration, the creation of the Department of Justice, the prosecution of about 2,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists, it is a victory of Douglass's ideas. And if you read the book, you'll see I talk about William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells fighting back against Wilson, and the members of the grand jury and people like Daniel Ellsberg, who did try to fight back against Nixon. In the Nixon example, I say we're still in the midst of that crisis in many ways. We tried to recover from Watergate, but are still facing it. And I had the last interview with Ellsberg, I should say, before his death, extensive interview about Watergate and the various other crimes that are unknown that were covered up because of the pardon, in particular against him. Many of them targeted him. Nixon was obsessed with Ellsberg. He called him the main ball, and said, we need our own Ellsberg. He was talking about him all the time. So in all these examples, it worked. We did fight back in just the way that I'm talking about. We won. So that's where my hope comes from. Now, it's not to say that we're guaranteed to win this time, but I believe we will.
Well, Corey, it's been a great discussion, and I would love to have you as a guest in the future, and I'll be listening to your podcast.
Thanks so much, Rich. It's such a pleasure to be with you. And I'll just remind those who are watching us that I'm on Substack. We have not just we kind of go beyond the episode, talk about behind the scenes. We have links. We talk about each of the stories that we cover, and we provide hope. So check us out on Substack. And then you can find Youth in the Office podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And we also have a video version on YouTube too.
Great. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rich.